Well, thank you very much, John. Yes, I was asked last minute to put a white rabbit out of the hat, and since I don't wear a hat, I guess this is the closest I can get to a white rabbit right now. So I think a question which keeps coming up again and again for all us supply chain professionals is how do we deal with the change we need? Because the business evolves, the environment for trading evolves, the marketplace evolves. So how do we go about creating the change that we want? So I pulled together this agenda with some keywords where first of all, some of the key things is to create the context for change that we need. And after that, we need to figure out, be very cautious about how we take the brain to work. Because we're still humans, we have limitations, and we need to make sure that we don't expect too much of the way we interact in our processes. And then, of course, if there is no social synergy, then people don't like to work there, and then you're going to lose your core competences, and then you're back to square one again. So you might have spent years on training somebody to really come up to date, and now suddenly they leave. So, however, if you have a social context where they say, we really love working here, the chances are they will stay longer, and it's not so much about, you can say, giving them opportunities. Trust me, they will find new ventures and opportunities themselves within the business if they like the people they work with. Then, of course, when we got all of this in place, the challenge comes up of making those prototype changes. We all want things running as usual. We like to know that we don't swap around from Mac to Windows and then to Linux and then back to Mac again. We like having a stable operating context. But sometimes we need to introduce changes which we present in a manner which is digestible to people. Something where we don't offend anybody, where we don't make people angry, but we see them actually, guys, there's a value here. Yes, there might be a little bit of uncertainty about how your work is going to change in the future, but we cover that up front. So making prototype changes and bringing that in is, of course, a question about managing risk across all processes. And considering that in detail is something I'll touch on as the fourth point. The next one is de-risking our projects. And it's something that I've been looking at for a long time and saying, how do we actually take the risk out of projects, both small and large, mission critical, or just something that a part of our consumer group finds is very interesting. So, going straight into it, I would say creating the context for change is where we start. Some simple keywords to set the clear incremental goals, engineering the change and staying tech aware but being demand driven is some buzzwords which I've picked up several places. I spoke with, I was visiting NVIDIA in February, and they had a large conference in San Jose, and I met with the head of venture capital from Morgan Stanley and asked, when you're looking at small businesses where you want to invest in, what is actually that you expect that would be critical for them to be able to sustain their growth? And he said to me, small or large, it doesn't really matter. If they don't have a clear idea of the tech that they engage with and where the demand for that tech is, they can be as enormously tech aware, but if it's not demand driven, it will fall over. So with that in mind, a lot of people who are tech driven and say, oh, this is new, that is new, this is new, they just create noise because they don't link it directly to demand. It's nice to be aware of what's out there in the market. Is it cloud? Is it just foggy? Or is it in-house IT? But taking that whole bigger picture is a very important element. So another aspect which I think is very important is to think about how we engineer that change. I put this up here at one of our catapults here in UK, which are funding a lot of growth for innovative businesses, and said, so when we look into how we actually engineer those new businesses or engineer new business processes, what is it exactly that we're trying to put together in terms of architecture and processes? And a lot of people, they got quite surprised by this, so I'll actually just briefly take the time to go through it. We start on the one side with the system analysis. We go through a requirements definition, we go to a system design, and link all our, you can say, ideas of what it is for change that's required and how we actually realize that usability realize usability fulfillment when the change is implemented. And a lot of people, they don't go through this longer process where they take that context they're working with and break it down into business processes. They tear out key use cases and from that extract scenarios and finally create test cases. A lot of people, they stop at the use case level and say, okay, when we know this, then we're kind of done. But this is where we often end up in that IT bites the hand that feeds it. Because IT cannot operate when we need to do system level changes without having very specific details on both component and processes and how these things are going to add up as an architecture to some later on component level deliverables. So component level deliverers, what is that exactly? Well, to be honest, I don't even have a clue. It depends on the use case or the scenario in itself. But we're trying to build up and set up a capability which we can then take to some functional and operational deliverables, which then again add up to the enabled business capabilities. And the terminology which is used on the way up here, starting at very heavy tech and then becomes more and more market, is very difficult translation. It's like speaking completely different languages in that process. However, through that process, people often discover what is it actually they're trying to purchase. I've heard of these mega projects where people say, okay, we are trying to put all of these different change elements into a big strategic framework, and then we're going to roll it out with 100 different changes, and it's going to cost 1 million IT hours, but when it's done, everything's going to be fantastic. Well, actually, often the change we need is much more incremental. Sure, there are times where you do a shift from one strategic platform to another, but normally then we also have a crisis to support people's engagement in making that change. So with that in mind, I think the key here is that often we cut this process very short, and when we are trying to create a context for change, we often kick it off before people actually know what we are trying to do. And that makes the rest of the work a lot harder. So from that part, the next thing that comes in mind is when we shift over and we have a clear idea of where we want to go, then how are we actually going to enable it? And that brings me into how we actually take the brain to work. When I'll get back to that in a second. There's a guy named Raymond Pankow who's done a lot of research on spreadsheet errors. And since spreadsheets is kind of the Swiss Army knife of all businesses, I thought it could be interesting just to pick up some of the key comments here. First thing is that he finds that spreadsheet errors, they're rare per cell basis, which we say, okay, yeah, we pay attention to stuff and we get it right. But in larger programs, when we work with Excel, we often find at least one incorrect bottom line, and that can be as disastrous as saying, sorry, all our revenues don't add up anymore. We also see that errors, they are extremely difficult for people to detect. I mean, we all suffer from the baby duck syndrome that, you know, the first thing we see is the one we fall in love with and he thinks it's mama. But with, again, the spreadsheets that we create ourselves, same psychology applies. We build it, we created it, now we think it's the best thing in the world. So, and third thing is that spreadsheet developers and corporations in general, they're highly overconfident in the accuracy of their spreadsheets. And the disconnect, of course, with these two first research conclusions is that it just appears to be the way that the human brain works. We are confident in the things that we think we pay attention to and we build. But more importantly, we often need to figure out that we are aware of very few of the errors that we make. Of course, we're all proud when we ferret out that something didn't add up and we now find that the errors in our spreadsheets, which followed the business case for change or whatever came to it, might be based on some assumptions which don't last in the big range. But again, we end up with a question about what is it that we as humans can work with. For example, when we go into IT, why don't we just write the code and go straight from code writing into deployment mode? Why do we have all this testing in between? Obviously, of that era, an IT sector has suffered under this for many years, and they're always the ones who get beaten up when the business processes don't work, because code today is our new infrastructure. It's not the warehouses, it's not the trucks, it's not the factories. Yes, they all add up together, but what matters is literally the information flow that triggers the physical activities. And this is where we burn our cash.